Good afternoon. I'm Michael Nowakowski with the Army Cyber Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the Analytics and Acquisition panel. We've got three sets of papers that we're going to go through today, and each of the speakers will have about 25 minutes, and they'll ask for questions and answers at the end of their presentations. Our first speaker today is Dr. David Froman. He studied applied physics at Caltech and electrical engineering at the University of Washington, and he worked in tech in Seattle during the dot-com boom. And then he pursued his interest in cognitive science through a doctorate at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Since the rapid emergence of hostile social media influence as a national security issue in 2016, David has been applying his expertise to this arena. So I'd like to welcome Dr. David Froman.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. This, as you might have been able to tell from my bio, I've changed fields a few times, and this is my first time giving a public presentation in my new field. So bear with me here. As he said in the introduction, I think we all know that this idea of hostile manipulation using social media is a pretty new field. We're only, you can tell from a lot of the talks that we've had so far today that we're all only just coming to grips with cyber warfare and cybersecurity. And I'm going to try to tell you that that's already yesterday's news. Just like Peter Singer was saying, I'm a big fan of his work, like war, I'm not even sure what to call it. In fact, let me just start with an anecdote here. So cybersecurity, cyber warfare, there was an email hack. Our friend from the keynote discovered that Russian hackers had used a classic spear phishing attack to get access to some email servers. They stole a bunch of data, and then that was the end of the story, right? They stole data because they wanted the data. Well, no, obviously not. What really happened there was that they stole those emails for the purpose of manipulating mass sentiment for political influence goals. So the emails were weaponized. They filtered the emails. They chose certain subsets of emails. They released them at very specific times that were choreographed to the news cycle. So we understand cybersecurity. We have a terminology. We have frameworks for that. But what is this new thing? How does it work? What is it even called? Information warfare, cyber-enhanced mass influence operations, like war is a very catchy term, but I'm not convinced that it's going to be the final choice for the new terminology. We need a science of cyber-enhanced mass influence operations. We don't even have a name for it yet, so we need a name for it. And like I said at the beginning, cyber warfare, we do need to prepare for that, but that's kind of the last war. We're kind of already in the middle of cyber-enhanced mass influence using social media. I work in Silicon Valley at a social media company that you've heard of. They asked me to leave my affiliation off of this. There were a lot of negotiations going on to the last minute there. So it is a pretty sensitive topic. It's a very new thing. It's very sensitive. We don't really know what to do about it yet. So what I think we should do about it is we should take a security approach. So say we want to secure some critical infrastructure. I'm just going to use the water supply as a very simple reference point. We know that there's a danger of pollution of the water supply. Somebody might throw something into an open air reservoir. There might be contamination by terrorists. So as soon as we started to be concerned about this, we handed it off to security engineers, the experts, and they analyzed the water supply. They determined what was the function of the system that they wanted to protect. It's supposed to supply potable water without interruption, and we have to maintain trust in the system. And based on this engineering approach, the primary things to be done were putting covers over the reservoirs, et cetera. Whoops, that slide was supposed to be hidden. So now say we want to apply a security approach to the election system. We're worried that people might be using social media to influence the election. Well, in order to do that, you have to start by being able to describe the system that you're trying to protect and understand it and model it. So the basic function of democracy is that you have population preferences, and then you have some sort of system or a function that acts on those preferences, and then the output of that function is a government and policy position. Now, that analysis, is that going to lead you immediately into a whole bunch of cyber terms like passwords, buffer overflows, public key encryption, static analysis? No, obviously not. We're talking political economics, social choice theory, sociology, mass psychology. It's a whole other world. The tools, the tactics, and the weapons are based on big data, news, and social media, fake news, real news. Of course, there's also an element of traditional cybersecurity, but there is something new here. So it's related to, there's a lot of overlap, but it's not the same. And I'm going to take a step off of my slides here for a second and say that this is actually kind of a controversy among those of us who are really interested in this new field of social media influence. There are people who insist that it really is just a part of cybersecurity. And then there are other people like Herb Lin and Peter Singer are both here, and if you get a chance to talk to them or hear anything they have to say, I highly recommend it because they agree with my position, which is that it is a whole new thing that we really have to take seriously as its own thing and develop a new science. So let's say we've decided that we are going to build this new science. We're going to start with political economics, social choice theory, and so on and so forth. I'm going to give you a little taste of this, assuming that you're not all familiar with this already. I think some of you, I see a couple familiar faces in the audience, so I know that there are a few people who are already familiar with this way of talking. My favorite sort of entry point into this world is the concept of the Overton window. If you're trying to describe the political views of a population, the Overton window is a concept that describes what's the range of public discourse that's acceptable. Now, it's not the range of an individual's belief, it's a property of a sort of media ecosystem as a whole. So for example, if somebody goes on TV and the interviewer asks them, what do you think about abortion? They might say, I'm in favor of it or I'm against it, and either one of those is okay. But if they start talking about aliens and pyramids, then they're just going to kick them off the show. That's not within the acceptable realm of discourse on that topic. Now, this was originally defined purely in terms of a sort of left-right spectrum. I think that most people by now realize that the idea of a left-right spectrum to describe politics is not really adequate, and there's a lot more variation than that in the American population or in any population. The idea of the Nolan plot extends it to 2 dimensions. It was very used in a lot of literature. This is an example of that kind of plot, the social and economic dimensions. In fact, there are a lot of people doing work, especially using big data, social media. Companies like Cambridge Analytica were very interested in collecting data on political preferences and using dimension reduction to try to figure out what's the true number of dimensions, which is more like about a dozen to get a really accurate representation. Now, if you take the idea of the Overton window as just a range on a left-right plot and you extend it to this higher set of dimensions, then you're drawing a region. And what is acceptable discourse is going to be somewhere in there, but not outside. So this out here in the fringe, whoops, wrong button. This out here in the fringe, that would be like the alien conspiracy theory. But somewhere in here, anywhere across the main spectrum is all acceptable discourse. It's not a matter of like which political position it is. It's just a matter of what can you even get away with talking about at all. And now there's an important thing that you have to notice here, which is that some issues are very, very polarized. So for instance, using the example of abortion, there may not actually be anyone in America who believes something that's not extreme. Everybody might be either pro or con. But if you bring someone on a TV show and they advocate a compromise position, that's generally acceptable. You know, compromise, moderation. In other words, in mathematical terms, You take a linear combination of 2 points in the disjoint set, and then you have to include that in the set because those are considered acceptable. This was meant to say, what about the people in the middle? The answers of the people in the middle are also acceptable. So we've just mathematically defined the idea of a convex hull. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting with an intuitive description based on sort of political philosophy, and I'm moving towards a more mathematical description, because what I eventually wanted to be doing is for big data, for the social, maybe the social media companies will do this internally, maybe government agencies will be doing this. In any case, we have to be able to build computational systems if we're going to do anything with this stuff at scale and in real time. So this defines the idea of the Overton hull, or the Overton blob, something like that. Again, there's not really terminology for these things yet. So that is what it looks like if you take the convex hull of those two disjoint circles. Now, even just that is enough to start doing a little bit of analysis and thinking about what might be possible and what, you know, an intuition pump to make us start thinking about what might be relevant within the context of this way of thinking about things. So again, I think my my deleted slides got undeleted at some point with the export. So say someone wants to radically change public policy. Now that would mean that if they want to talk about something that's outside the window of acceptable discourse, they might have to move the discourse a little bit at a time, because you can't just say something outside of the window. That's the definition of what we're talking about here. So the foot in the door technique is kind of a standard term that means you're stretching the window of credulity a little bit at a time. You know, you make a slightly higher offer, you make a slightly higher offer. You move people a little bit at a time. This is time and resource intensive, and this is the way traditional political campaigning, for instance, works. And to a certain extent, I would say that this is actually fine, and this is kind of what we want people to be doing. We don't really want the entire political system to be sort of replaced with some other set of beliefs overnight. But sometimes someone, maybe a hostile adversary, may want to radically change our political system all at once. What sorts of techniques might they use to stretch the window rapidly? So again, from the classical literature on persuasion, there's the door in the face technique, which is kind of a complement, where you start with an outrageous proposition, and then in comparison to that, something else might seem not nearly so bad. For example, if one teenager eats a spoonful of cinnamon, that's just crazy. But if enough do it, then it's news. And let's not even talk about Tide Pods. So say you were able to suddenly get it in the news that there were a bunch of people who believed something way out here on the fringe. And don't worry about what these two axes are, because in general, I'm using this as a representation of a much higher dimensional parameter space. So it could be anything. You put some people way out in the fringe. Now, as soon as they make it into the news, then it is prima facie a part of public discourse, which means now all of a sudden the convex hull that includes everything in between has immediately been stretched to include an enormous amount of new territory. So that area that I had labeled before as being unacceptable is now suddenly acceptable. And you didn't have to do all the work of advocating for that intermediate position. So this is one way that you might accomplish something like that. It's very hard to change people's beliefs. People are not really subject to rational, changing their minds through rational input. However, one thing you might do is you might notice that there are a whole lot of people out there that are kind of scattered around the fringes who believe a lot of crazy things. Now, if you could find a way to kind of gather up all the conspiracy theorists and get them all on board with one master conspiracy theory, which, you know, years ago I used to listen to these radio shows. I was a real fan of conspiracy theories. It was all fun and games. Conspiracy theories didn't have the same sort of threatening overtones that it does now. There were people who believed in the lizard people. There were people who believed the moon landing was fake. There were people who believed in the 13 crystal skulls. There were people who believed in the Anunnaki. There were people who, believed in Area 51, alien autopsies. There's probably people here who know the truth about that one. But now what you see if you go out on the internet and you look in these fringe groups and stuff like that is that there's still all these people that believe all these things, but a whole lot of them have kind of bought into a few master conspiracy theories that ties everything together. Now, the control conspiracy theories are pretty unreasonable. But if you're familiar with the psychology of how the 419 scams work, you would get these emails where it's written in all capital letters, it's full of spelling errors and grammar errors. It was a joke 10 years ago. Oh, look, another one of these Nigerian prince emails. But actually, there was a very clever system to why those emails were written that way. They were written to be completely unbelievable by any reasonable person in order to guarantee that the scammers would only get responses from unreasonable people that they would be able to work with. So, again, this is a well-established technique of manipulation. You start with something really unreasonable, and then you know that the only people buying into it are going to be easy for you to work with. Of course, in the Cold War, the Soviets were very skilled with using the concept of the useful idiots as a way of infiltrating our society and getting people to do what they want. So in a way, you could think of what I'm describing here as just an extension of that through social media mass propaganda to a population level of useful idiots, which you might call a demographic of useful idiots. Some people don't really like this terminology, so I apologize if you don't like this terminology. In any case, the only point of that is to provide one example kind of worked through using this way of looking at things. I don't mean to imply that this is the only thing that's going on or if this is even the most important thing that's going on. It's just one example of how you can start to look at social media influence and build a mathematical framework around it, which is then potentially applicable in practical terms. So if you were able to actually generate this map in real time by, say, monitoring social media and generating some sort of dashboard that showed you the shifting shape of the blob of public opinion, then you would be able to see when sort of a new pseudopod extended out from the blob very suddenly rather than maybe what might normally be a sort of organic growth. This 50 is the end, right? Yeah, okay. So what I would like to see happen, among other things, would be for the social media companies to work together and possibly to work with governments who had other monitoring abilities to do this and to generate this sort of public dashboard. Since I'm getting prompted to hurry up, I'll just skip ahead of that. And I'm going to skip this altogether. And thank you for your attention, economy. And are there any questions or comments?
Sir, Machibin Gagne, I'm just curious as to maybe when the window is stretched by this sole incident, like you said, maybe seeing something crazy on TV or in a news story, what allows the stretched hole to persist and kind of remain stretched?
I would say that that's actually the most important point of all this. I would postulate, and this would, require some research, which I don't know if we have time for. I would postulate that if you look at a graph like this, if you look at a plot in however many dimensions, there's going to be a certain kind of tendency for it to cluster around fairly reasonable things, except for maybe a little bit of noise around the fringes. The only way that you're going to get a high concentration of people who all believe some nonsense is by if somebody's spending a lot of energy on propaganda. So you might, you have a bunch of botnets, you have some paid influencers, you have all these kinds of, all these techniques that you're familiar with, troll farms, sock puppets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to put a lot of effort into gathering a group of people together and sort of anchoring them on a point that you're interested in for strategic reasons. I think that because of the social nature of social media, once these people have sort of come together, they will form communities of their own, and there will be a little bit of cohesion. They'll tend to stick together. So for instance, a German journalist that I was talking to about this, he said that they use deplatforming a lot to prevent, in Germany specifically, they use deplatforming. If anybody starts posting Nazi symbols online, then they just kick them off immediately. There's no sort of debate in the same way there would be at like Twitter or Facebook or something here. There's just a zero tolerance policy. And that is a pretty good preventative measure that prevents Nazi communities from forming online in Germany. Now, once you have a community that has formed and then you deplatform them, they're not just going to stop being a community. So it's not really very good. Deplatforming alone isn't very good to fracture a community that has already formed. What you would have to do instead was some sort of counter offense, which techniques would have to be developed for that. It could be kind of complicated. It sort of depends on whether the community in question had a strong coherence. If the only thing holding the group together was just a lot of botnets and a lot of sock puppets and a lot of active influence, then you could kind of just shut down the botnets, and then the community will sort of fall apart on its own. But if you have something that's really taken on a life of its own, then it may not be possible to do anything about that without active countermeasures. But just showing, I think that the most important thing is just the visibility, because if everybody can see everything that's going on, then even if the small number of people is very adhering, very closely tied to each other, it's not going to influence the rest of the population that much if everybody knows that this is what's happening. Hi.
Very good talk. I very much enjoyed it. I wanted to kind of come back to what you had mentioned about the weaponizing of information, that controlled release. And I was curious, have you done any temporal analysis to see how that ties everything together and how it actually moves these groups? Because a lot of the goals a lot of times is really, it may not necessarily be to get somebody to buy into the conspiracy theory as much as it is to simply paralyze a group of people so that they throw up their hands and say, I don't know what to do.
Yes. The answer to everything you're saying is yes. The first project that I did on this was using independent component analysis on sort of a corpus of political and conspiracy relevant words on Google Trends, and then cross-correlating it with political timelines, taken from news reports. So I had a whole timeline of like all the key things that happened, and then what you could see in the ICA of the trends was that there would be sort of one component that would kind of like ramp up after something happened, and then another one that would kind of kick up right after that was sort of a counter narrative designed to defuse the first narrative. And I think that there's probably a lot more and more frequent applications of what you just said, which is why I wanted to make sure I gave a disclaimer that I wasn't trying to say that this was the only thing or even the most important thing going on. It's just kind of a particularly interesting and especially visually interesting example to show. I think that in general, the visualization dashboard would be a lot more useful for just seeing this process of like one thing kicks up and then another thing kicks up right after it. And then you think, oh, maybe that is a hostile narrative that's designed, maybe it's a hostile fake news narrative. Because of course, fake news, just totally fake news is not the same as active measures. Active measures is a problem for security, but just incorrect reportage is not really a threat to society. And in fact, I saw a talk by someone who had analyzed the structure of fake news in different countries around the world, and she was saying that in South Africa, one of the biggest fake news stories was that if you see an orange in the road, you shouldn't run over it with your car because it's probably filled with nails. And apparently, people were really, really, really into this story in South Africa, and it spread like wildfire. But it's not a part of any political campaign. It's just something that people caught on for reasons that are unclear to me. And I don't think we need a really strict campaign of fighting back against the oranges full of nails.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker is Samyoti Sarkor. He's a PhD student studying computer science at Arizona State University. He's advised by Dr. Paolo Shakarian, and his work focuses on social network analysis, mining, and its applications.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm a PhD student at ASU, and I'm advised by Paolo Shakarian, who is also the director of the Cyber Socio-Intelligence Systems Lab. And my talk today is on predicting enterprise cyber incidents using social network analysis on the dark web hacker forums. So since the premise of my entire research is based on the data from the dark web, I'll just start by giving you an idea of what the dark web is and why people are getting interested. So what generally when we try to search for web pages, we actually scratch the surface of the web, the results which are indexed by the famous search engines or otherwise. But what lies behind also is something called deep web, which are results which had been indexed, but they lost popularity over time, and now you won't be able to retrieve those results. But dark web is one special component of the web that just not only you won't be able to retrieve the results, but you would need special software to access that part of the web. And it has two major components. One is the forums, which are similar to, if you have used Reddit forums, they are very similar to social media forums where users can come, start a thread, they can post replies, and then there are dynamics of interactions. And then there are marketplaces where you can just trade commodities, so where there can be selling of exploits and different vulnerabilities and hacking stuff. But this entire research is based on specifically the data set from the forums. And so in the current scenario, what people generally do from security analytics to attack prediction, they would entirely rely on vulnerabilities being discussed in social media platforms. So what people would just do is that they would use features related to these vulnerabilities, and the essence is to see whether these vulnerabilities would be exploited. So that's the basic. And then once you know that whether these vulnerabilities would be exploited, they would use this as a precursor for cyber attack prediction to see whether these vulnerabilities can be exploited in real time, or what is the severity of these vulnerabilities. But the problem is that there are a lot of vulnerabilities. Getting to know which vulnerabilities are actually important or can be exploited is a difficult problem. So the premise of this research is based on, can we bypass this dependence on just vulnerability exploitation and instead monitor discussions around vulnerabilities to directly predict cyber attacks. And so the goal of this research is that we have given as input some forum discussions among users over a period of time. And the main idea here is to see whether we can uncover the dynamics of interactions or patterns of interactions among users, and then use these patterns of interactions to predict external enterprise attacks. And the key here is that these attacks are actually on an external enterprise company, which may not be related to or have no association with any dark web data, but we try to correlate these attacks to see whether the dynamics of interactions in dark web can in any way help predict these kinds of enterprise attacks. And so the contributions of our research is that we use social network analysis on the user reply networks in the dark web. But the main challenge in dark web is that while there can be really useful information about some vulnerabilities being exploited or being traded or that have potential for attacks, there is actually a lot of noise information. And the difficulty is to actually mine the important patterns, important interactions out of this whole noise, and to see which of them are actually important that can also help in predicting attacks. And this, we try to use some techniques that can actually help us mine the important interactions and remove the noise from this. And then we use a supervised learning approach to predict these attacks on a daily basis. And I'll just go through the data sources that we use. So we use 3 data sources for this problem. The first is the ground truth for the attacks. And this was given by the IARPA cause program that gave us the attack data set, ground truth data set from a corporation called Armstrong. And it had given a security attack incidents over a period of from April 2016 to September 2017. And each data point is a record of some malicious attempt to infiltrate their systems. And these were detected by their attack detectors in their host systems. And so they gathered these data set and we got it from them. And we considered two kinds of attacks in their ground truth. One was malicious email, which is if an email either contains a malicious email attachment or a link to a malicious destination. And the second is endpoint malware. That is, if a malware is discovered on an endpoint device. So you can see that the distribution of weekly distribution attacks are pretty evenly distributed for malicious email, but there is some kind of data collection bias for the endpoint malware. And we try to split our training and test in such a way that we can still use this kind of we can still avoid this collection bias. And the dark web dataset is the one that we got from the SDK by CyCON, and that provides us with structured forum data in a given time frame. So a dark web, you can understand, is very similar to a Reddit forum. You have several threads initiated by users, and then different users come and reply to this thread. So you have a thread, a reply structure over a period of time. So and you have multiple threads over a period of time. And there are several forums in dark webs. We consider around 170 forums, but a lot of forums didn't have much data over this period. So what we did was we considered this time frame from Jan 2016 to September 2017, and this was done to overlap the attack data set time frame. And we considered forums which have more than 5,000 posts in these in this time frame, and that gave us 53 forums. And the total number of posts were around 557K posts, irrespective of the threads or the users. And the third data set that we use is the CV and CPE data. For those of you who have been working on vulnerabilities, I'm sure you know these terms. So CV is actually indexing for the vulnerabilities that have been disclosed or have been reported, and these are actually maintained by this MITRE corporation. So we collected all the vulnerabilities mentioned in the forums in the period from the same period that we collected the data. And the total number of unique CVs which were mentioned, at least one in the dark web, was 3553 across all forums. And the CP is actually a naming scheme for grouping the CVs. So while you can see that CP out of flash is one CPE which can have different CVEs, one CV can also be tagged to multiple CPEs. So that's how the hierarchy is being done from CPEs to CVEs. So like I said, the main challenge, one of the challenges of this is that since we have external enterprise data, and we did not get any metadata that would straight away tell us which vulnerabilities caused the incidents. So it's very difficult to identify the causation from going from dark web to the actual attacks. So what we did was given that we are trying to predict these daily attacks, predict this time series of whether they would attack on any single day, we try to take the history of time series representation of some features, which I will go on to describe with a delta time gap before the prediction period. And this delta is actually a hyperparameter that we manually tune to say which is the best fit. And so the main 4 steps are, we first create the reply network of interactions from forum discussions, and then the idea of trying to see whether there are several posts which gain traction among important communities of users who are credible in terms of replies or in terms of knowledge about CVEs. We see whether there are posts on a daily basis which gain traction among these communities. So to know which of these users are credible, we use a set of constraints to extract these set of users, and which we term experts in these networks. And then we use several features based on path structures between experts and non-experts as a measure of whether there would be a trigger for an impending attack. And then we use a supervised learning model to use this time series representation and predict attacks on a daily basis. So the main idea is to compute features in each forum. So we have 53 forums. We need to compute these several features in each forum on a daily basis. And so I'll give you a brief gist of this instead of going to details. Is that so we basically use 2 networks. So considering that the time series for a time period of tau starts from T1, it goes to T1. So tau is a set of time points, so it's a T1, T2 up to Tn. So we considered temporal networks over each of these time points. And then this is a GH tau, is a historical network prior to this start of this time series representation. And this GH tau is actually used for filtering out experts. So and as we go on, so these networks are temporal networks on a daily basis. This is a static network, same for all these time points. And there is an operation called merge, for which we merge these 2 networks over each time period. And we use this to extract experts, and then we compute several features over these merged networks. And the constraints for experts, like I said, that we're trying to see whether there are credible users who are replying to certain posts. And so if a post is important and is not noisy, then it should have gained traction among these important community of users. And so the three properties are whether a user who has mentioned at least one CV in the post. So that's to see whether a user is actually knowledgeable about the CVs that are being discussed. And then these CVs that the user has posted should be in the top CVs. So we have a mechanism to rank the CPs for a time frame based on the frequency of replies that the CVs in those CPs got. So we try to see whether the user is not just posting CVs, but that's also an important CVE given the set of CPEs and the CVs that are being indexed. And then the integrity of the users in this merged network should also, in this historical network, should cross a threshold. This is to see that whether if a user is posting, there are several users who are also replying. It's just not that some user is posting and there is nobody who's replying. And because there can be bots who can be just manually generating a lot of posts, but which may not get replies. So these three, we feel that these three constraints are important in declaring some user as having some credible knowledge about in these forums. And to test whether these constants make any sense, we do a two sample t-test in which we collected time periods of three widely known security breaches: the WannaCry ransomware attack, the Petya cyber attack, and the Equifax breach attack. So we collected the time periods of three widely known security breaches, and we considered two sets of users: the experts in the months prior to the weeks in which these attack events were reported, and the users who were not experts but have mentioned at least one CV in their posts in that same time period. So these are the two sets of users we are considering. And then we conduct a two-sample t-test, which tells us whether the experts have engaged in more interactions than the non-experts. So you can see that the null hypothesis says that the experts have a degree which is less than, which means that they have interacted or replied less than the interactions. And when we do this test, we have this null hypothesis which is rejected at alpha. So alpha equals at the significance level of 0.01 with a p-value of a very low p-value. But this test is just not sufficient. We also have to test whether we consider randomly 4 weeks from the data set, because that could have a correlation bias. So to avoid that correlation bias, we just conduct a two-sample t-test, which by randomly picking 4 points, and we try to see whether the null hypothesis is not rejected. So what this suggests is that two things. One, that with high probability, because this is a hypothesis test, it's a frequentist approach, we have repeated sampling. So with high probability, experts tend to interact more our selection of experts tend to interact more prior to real-world cybersecurity breaches. And the second thing is that this test also suggests that interactions with its experts are more correlated with the important cybersecurity event. Of course, there is no declaration of a causation, because these are just the tests are to see whether there is a correlation, and this correlation does not have any bias. And so so the main features that we try to test were these expert-centric features, which were actually path structures between the experts and the non-experts over a period of time. And these were some forum and statistics and network centralities that we use as baseline to see whether the path structures between these set of users, the experts and the non-experts, are actually useful. I'll just go probably one or two on graph conductance and shortest path if I have time. And so this is the agenda boils down to this. We have this time series representation of several features over several forums, and we have to predict a daily attack. So we label each day as 1 if there is at least one attack, and a 0 if there is no attack. So this is the weekly distribution. I didn't show the daily distribution. The daily distribution is very sparse, actually. So if there is at least one attack on a day, we label that as instance as a 1, otherwise 0. So that's the classification problem. And we use a longitudinal logistic regression, because this helps in two things. Because we have the security incidents data is quite imbalanced. I will show the exact figure. So this helps in the idea of longitudinal logistic regression means that we are selecting particular time points. So given that you are trying to predict the attack on time t, we take the time series range for the feature from t minus delta to t minus eta minus delta, where delta and eta are hyperparameters. So we are trying to see whether we can predict delta days before the attack. So that's the hyperparameter, and what is the range of time points do we need that can help understand whether that's a trigger, that feature is a trigger for an attack. So this logistic regression helps us to actually use several regularization functions, because time series can have many points, but not all points will be informative. So this is just to see whether we can actually have use regularization. So I'll just go to the results. So I'll report the results from malicious email. So out of 335 days, there were attacks in 97 days, so which constitutes a 29% positive loss ratio. And we tried several hyperparameters, but the best ones were we have eta of 1 week and delta. So we can actually predict very well if we predict 8 days in advance of an attack. And so I'll go for the forum statistics. The best results were from actually, this is actually a bit mistake here. It's not from CV mentions, it's from the threads, number of threads. So what I wanted to say was that the best results were not from CV mentions. So it just goes on to say that if you remove everything and just focus on CVs, that will not give you the best results. So some kind of network analysis is actually useful in predicting attacks. And for the expert-centric features, we get the best results from graph conductance with an F1 measure of 0.53. So the higher, the better, against a random guess of 0.34. Graph conductance, in brief, is something that is actually, if you know about cuts in graphs, so graph conductance measures how closely knit communities are. So if a community is actually giving attention to a series of posts, that means that the graph conductance will be low, and that could be a trigger for an impending attack. And it's the best features in terms of F1, like I said, were graph conductance and shortest paths. And yeah, so we found that network analytics from node centrality is just computing some betweenness, page rank actually didn't help. They perform even worse than forum statistics, which goes on to say that if you just take an entire network, compute some features, that won't be actually very helpful. But you have to focus on a set of users that give you more information, because there is definitely a lot of noise when you consider the entire network. And so we try to do some kind of control experimental setup where we considered active weeks in which there were at least 5 attacks, because most of these weeks were very sparse. They hardly had probably 1 or 2 attacks. So we were trying to see whether we can only predict for high activity weeks. And we found that while the same features gave the same recall, but the precision actually improved, which means that our model actually could have a general prediction, a better prediction results in weeks that were actually high activity weeks. And unlike the results for all days, our model achieves high precision. So the main challenges is actually the aim of the last control experiment was to say that there is actually a very difficult procedure to correlate external attacks with dark web. And so that was the aim of the last experiment. But we try to show that the network, the graph structure is actually has some kind of useful information for predicting attacks. So that's the basic of my problem. Okay, am I done, or
do we have any questions in the audience? 1 or 2 questions?
Sorry, this is probably a really dumb question. Can you predict which industry it'll?
No, so these models have to be trained repeatedly from different different industries, because it totally depends on the attack labels.
Thanks. Great talk. You're using the dark web and indicators from there to predict the attacks. A significant number of attacks come from nation states that are unlikely to be talking about that on the dark web. Do you have a way to filter that out of the population of attacks that you're looking at?
Yeah, in my experience, I've not seen. So the dark web has forums catering to different languages. So there are forums in which there are Russian hackers. There are forums in which there are Chinese hackers, or there are different European hackers. So that one way of trying to do is to actually filter out forums based on the language, and that is also some researchers do that to filter out forums based on some language, and then try to see what kind of vulnerabilities those people in those languages are seeing. That could actually help a little bit about understanding where the attack is coming from or which vulnerability is important. And there was research in my lab which showed that if there is a vulnerability mentioned in Russian, that the likelihood of exploitation is quite high than if it's mentioned in some different language. So these kinds of things can actually help understand what's the nature of the vulnerability being exploited.
All right, thank you. So our last group that's going to be speaking today is Dr. Thomas Clemis. He's the principal engineer and special projects lead at SimSpace Corporation. He spearheads advanced projects leveraging fundamental principles from data analytics, network science, machine learning, and applied mathematics to enhance cyber applications. Additionally, he's a colonel in the Air Force and is the senior advisor to the commander of the 318th Cyber Operations Group and leads a collaboration with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the 24th Air Force that is developing policy proposals to accelerate cyber acquisition. Speaking with Dr. Clemis is Ms. Rebecca Lively. She is the Chief of Cyber Technology Law for the 24th Air Force and Air Force Cyber Command at Joint Base San Antonio Lackland in Texas. Previously, Ms. Lively served as the primary legal advisor for the 688th Cyberspace Wing and oversaw all areas of cyber intellectual property law for both the 67th Cyberspace Wing and the 688th Cyberspace Wing.
So I really enjoyed the keynotes this morning. They provided a lot of material and supported kind of a lot of the ideas that we've been researching. One of the keynotes, I hope I don't mess up the name, Merle Mager is from Estonia, talked about the importance, really emphasized law, governance, and education as being kind of key topics to address in cyber, and that's kind of where our topic fits in. We've been studying different policy innovations that we hope can improve cyber acquisition, in particular the rapidity, the speed of it. Just to emphasize the point everyone's been making, this is our opinions, not the opinions of the government. So I'll be talking about the cyber landscape, which is kind of the context for our talk, kind of the policy innovations. And I think the first speaker, Dr. Froman, in his very first comment was talking about how we're just coming to grips. And that was a term we heard a lot this morning as well in the keynotes. The NDAAs, if you read them, even the recent ones, National Defense Authorization Act, reflect that Congress is still requesting cyber acquisition modifications, new approaches that will speed things up. You hear quotes from all kinds of officials. I think Secretary of Defense, I hope I'm getting this right, Mattis, capabilities must be delivered at the speed of need. What we understand, in our research really discovered or emphasizes cyber acquisition timescales are completely different than traditional acquisition, and that's a real problem. A traditional acquisition program takes many years, and it addresses a full life cycle, sustainment. The B-52 is a great example of that, and that you just think about that airplane, and it shows the excellence of traditional acquisitions, but it also highlights some of the key differences. Some cyber capabilities are needed in 2 weeks, and they might be used just once. So that is a key point, and highlights why there has to be a different approach. As far as accelerating threats, we had a number of speakers this morning emphasize how the environment is highly contested, the cyber environment, and a number of the keynotes actually brought up the point that it's taken us a while to recognize cyber as an actual domain of operations. We heard Colonel Tarian from the Estonia CCD COE mention that in 2004, Estonia was very proactive. they went and tried to organize a collaboration to share information about cyber, and they were kind of rebuffed a little bit. There was some resistance to doing that. Cyber is something commercial interests will take care of. And then after their subsequent attack, there was more traction. And we also heard General Wolfgang Renner speak about, in 2014, I thought it was very interesting, NATO recognized cyber as a domain of operations, 2014, not too long ago. And in the 2018, July, I think it was, if I'm remembering right, they set up the Cyber Operations Center. Well, that's there's been a lot going on before these things happened in the cyber domain that our adversaries have Dmitry Alperovich, the CloudStrike CEO, discussed that at length, and he also had I don't know if I agreed with all of his myth busting comments, but they were very interesting. Most of them I do agree with, and one of the ones that supported some of the assumptions in our paper was the geopolitical drivers across the domains are very similar, if not the same, and we have the same nation-state actors: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. And there's a lot of data that we were able to find from Council databases, data sets, Council of Foreign Relations, Microsoft Azure, if I'm pronouncing that right, reports, various community database. We just heard a speaker talk about some other data sets. They recount numerous incidences of adversary activities, and they support very strongly the view of very agile actors, adversaries with a great degree of freedom action, well-resourced, and kind of really ahead of us. And our final kind of contextual motivational item is the unrelenting pace of cyber transformation. Technological innovation kind of amplifies risk in some sense. If you think of kind of how frequently our computing systems are being innovated, well, that means there's not a lot of time to fix bugs, there's the new bugs being introduced constantly and new opportunities for exploit. We have complete paradigm shifts, cloud computing, mobile devices that kind of pull the rug out from what, you were good at defending against before. And these are major challenges to traditional acquisitions. A lot of, traditional acquisitions, if applied to cyber, the systems being delivered would already be obsolete. And so this brings up the key point. I hope I'm taking too long, but we need policy changes, which Rebecca will talk about.
I have no idea how to use this, but oh, yes, I do. I push the big green button and then it happens. I'm so excited. So I've been working in the DoD for over 8 years. I am a civilian. And so as a DoD civilian, one of the things that is expected of me is I sit around and I complain and I don't go anywhere. And I've spent a long time sitting around complaining and not going anywhere. And it's kind of cool because I used to be really, really cynical. And now I'm just kind of cynical because I used to be, my whole brief was, what's the problem? And I would go on because I was just trying to convince people that there's a problem. Like, we have a problem. And then in the last 2 years, all of a sudden, reading the National Defense Strategy, it's like, hey, there's a problem. And I'm in this 8-page summary or 10-page, I don't know, some number of pages, 12. It discusses in detail the problems that we have in acquisition. I mean, not exactly, but I can really easily apply it. It's clear that Secretary Mattis was talking to me personally, and that's also very reassuring. So what is the problem? First off, let me start. It's not an easy problem. If this were an easy problem, then there would be easy fixes and we would just move on and we would be done talking about it. There have been, since 1986, 300 formal studies on what is wrong with the acquisition system in one way or another. Many of those are, why is the acquisition system not adequate for cyber? In particular, this 2012 study that I've got up here really went into some of what I thought were my unique talking points, and then I learned that clearly no, somebody else has already thought of all my unique talking points, which is kind of a good thing because then I can cite to some people with slightly more authority than I have. But the general consensus is we have this rigid inflexible system, or at least a system that people believe is rigid and inflexible. And we are trying to keep applying that same exact set of tools and solutions to every single problem we have without flexing, without changing in any way. And that's ridiculous. So the good news is, I think people are starting to get that there's a problem. The bad news is that means that now that I've been complaining about the problem for years and years and years, they're like, okay, so what should we do? And I never got that far before. Like, I was just talking about the problem, and now I'm supposed to have some idea of what are solutions. And I'll be honest, I have no idea. So why am I here talking? Because I wrote a paper about it, and nobody else is doing that either. So I will start with, what is the DoD doing about it, and what is Congress doing about it? And they're actually doing something. So like I said, the National Defense Strategy, actually writing in our National Defense Strategy that we have a problem, I think is huge. Because that becomes, I mean, if you go to any event, everyone likes to quote the National Defense Strategy because it makes their mission relevant and it makes them relevant. And you know, it's good to quote too. So it is putting at our core of our National Defense Strategy that, like, look, we have a problem, I think is a big first step. There's something called the Section 809 panel. If you would like to read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of analysis of what the problem is, go there. I read it. It's all really good stuff. I was like, I'm so glad someone else is doing this. This is fantastic. Congress has expanded the authority for these other transaction agreements, which I'd be happy to talk about in more detail, but I'm not going to go on and on about here right now. But those give a lot of flexibility that I think, depending on how we decide to utilize them, could be very beneficial. And then there's tons and tons of pilot programs in all different areas doing all sorts of different things. There's good and bad to them. One of the things I've heard them referred to is silos of excellence, which is great if you're in the silo, and it kind of sucks if you're not. And I'm never in the silo. So somewhere someone is doing great things, and every time I get up and I speak, they're like, well, have you heard of this group at the Pentagon, or have you heard of this group over at, whatever lab? And I'm like, sure, but can we utilize that authority? Well, no. But they're there and they're doing really great things. And I'm like, well, that's fantastic for them. I'm super happy. Here's a 2018 memo for the acquisition workforce. And this is another reassuring thing. This is in the acquisition workforce, directed at the acquisition workforce, who I think a lot of people assume are the problem, but I will defend them rigorously. I'll defend anyone rigorously. I'm a lawyer, like whatever. I mean, if you pay me especially, I will defend you rigorously. But this is like saying, hey, you guys actually need to use these tools. You need to go faster. So that is what we're doing about it. What we kind of came up with for this project was, what are like some big things that we could say, if you do these 3 things, you'll be moving in the right direction at least. And what can we do today on those things? And what should we consider in the future? So I'll go through those 3 things in my remaining time before somebody starts like making these sorts of gestures in the back of the room. So the first one is manage rather than avoid risk. We're not terribly good at that in the DoD. We're like, oh, there's a risk. Let's not do that. Let's go a different way. And what happens is we end up avoiding all risks, and then at the expense of time. And so, okay, let's sit down. Let's have a committee. And there's actually one of the precursors to the CIA did a manual, an operational field support manual or something along those lines, back during the Cold War, I think, or some war. It's a long time ago. And it talks about how can you slow down a project. If you're like an insider and you'd like to like subtly sabotage things, what can you do? And one of the things is like form a committee and meet about it. And then like throw in like things like strict adherence to policy. Like, oh, are you sure we really have the authority to do that? This is legitimate like field sabotage manual. And that's what we're doing in our own acquisitions, which is kind of sad. So that itself is a risk. That process can be a risk, and I think we need to recognize that. So what can we do today about that? There are tailoring and waivers. There are different things that we can do now. Those are things we used to say and not do. There are now things that like I've seen people actually saying, hey, let's pursue a waiver. And then everyone's like, sure, waived. And it's fantastic. What should we consider in the future? Policy, emphasis, and training. All right, 2 more ideas. Delegate. So I work for a 2-star commander. You would think a 2-star commander, maybe we can trust him at this point. Apparently, no, we cannot. They will not delegate any real like cool authorities to him when it comes to acquisition, because he's not an acquisition guy and he's just an operational guy. And he might not understand it, he might not trust it. So we have these great Air Force level authorities and waivers and stuff, and my boss can't use any of it. And so he goes to Congress, and they're like, wow, there's a lot of problems. What can we do? What new policies do you need? And the answer is, we don't need any new policies in the Air Force. We need them to be delegated, except for we're not going to say that to Congress, well, except for I am right now, but these are my views and my views alone. But I'm saying in that I'm being recorded, although I'm sure Congress isn't going to watch because why would they? And that's cool too. Although if you are, hey. So anyway, what should we consider in the future? I think mandatory delegations in policy. This isn't a terribly popular idea if you are the guy at the top of the totem pole who has all the authority right now. Like being told, hey, you can't keep this authority, you don't have that option, doesn't feel great. But I think if we put mandatory delegations in, there might be something there. And then one of the ideas we came up with too is there's a lot of worry about what is the risk if we delegate too far down. And there are risks, especially if we're trying to move fast. And so we can't audit, we can't verify, we can't approve up front. So maybe some sort of after the fact auditing. So we could say, okay, we've given this guy some authority. Has he totally screwed it up? Let's go and look and see in the past. And then the third idea is, and this sounds so obvious, but we're not doing it. So if it was really that obvious, we'd be doing it, and I wouldn't have to put a slide that says treat different problems differently. Like this sounds like a tautology, but it's really not. Like we have this giant system that we apply like as a one-size-fits-all solution to everything. Like, oh, you have an acquisition? Go to this 1,000-page manual, and you'll know how to handle it. And that's not useful, that's not helpful, and it doesn't make things any better. So there are existing permissions, there are existing pilot programs. Find them, seek them out, take advantage of them. That's what we can do today. And then in the future, being more willing to treat different problems differently. Being willing to say, look, we're carving out cyberspace, maybe offensive cyber ops. We're carving that out. You have your own authorities. Like, yes, that's less than ideal when it comes to maintaining things and keeping them up to date, but it might be exactly what we need when it comes to actually moving quicker. So that is the gist. I will now conclude with this, my conclusion. And I would love to take any questions. I don't know, this just looks cool. So there it is. Questions? Or is it the end of the day? And
Thank you for the presentation. That was very good. So my question is, understanding that the acquisition process is slow, it's slow for a reason to prevent somebody from going out and buying something, and then 6 months later, a new commander comes in and says, well, that's not what I want to do. I want to do this other thing. So is there a way to speed it up, but still prevent weird things from coming into the system that are going to get thrown out the next time somebody new comes in?
And I think there's a balancing. So it's a great question. I mean, if I'm spending $5 billion, I probably need some oversight and, some adult supervision. If I'm spending $500,000 in the DoD, that sounds like a lot to me. If I was spending $500,000, there'd be a lot of supervision and responsibility. But in the DoD, if we're spending $500,000, there's a risk that, maybe the next guy's not going to like it. Maybe it's not going to work out. But maybe if we could just pull the trigger and spend that money now without having to go through years of planning and requirements, figuring, and we'll actually get something we need and can maybe use, maybe it's okay to fail. Maybe it's okay if the next guy throws it out. And I think that's the balance we lack right now. Thank you.